June 6, 1944, the coast of Normandy, France. The ramps dropped, cold seawater rushed in, men died before their boots touched French soil. On that single morning, the Allied world changed forever. American soldiers stormed Utah and Omaha. British and Canadian forces took gold, Juno, and sword. Side by side, they bled into the same sand. But it was what happened after that beach. In the decades that followed, in the jungles of Malaya, the frozen hills of Korea, the desert of Iraq, the mountains of Afghanistan, that forged something the military world rarely speaks about openly. Something that US Marines, the toughest warriors America produces, have admitted to, quietly, reluctantly, with the kind of respect that only soldiers understand. They said, "We've never seen anything like this." This is the story of what they saw and why they said it. To understand why US Marines look at British soldiers the way they do, you have to go back to where both traditions were born. Here is a fact that most Americans don't know. The United States Marine Corps, the most feared fighting force in American history, is in part a descendant of the British Royal Marines. The motto of the US Marines, Semper Fidelis, meaning always faithful, came after years during which an earlier informal motto, by sea and by land, was used. That phrase was borrowed almost directly from the Royal Marines' own motto, per mer, per terram, by sea, by land. These two institutions didn't just share history, they shared DNA. The British Royal Marines were founded in 1664. The United States Marine Corps was formally established in 1775. For over 2 centuries, these two forces evolved separately, sharpened by different wars, different climates, different enemies. And yet, every time they ended up fighting alongside each other, something remarkable happened. The Americans noticed something about the British that they couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the equipment. British soldiers often had less of it. It wasn't the numbers. The British military was always smaller. It was something harder to measure, something that lived inside the men themselves. May 26, 1940, Dunkirk, France. The British Expeditionary Force, over 330,000 men, was trapped. German armored divisions had cut them off. The Luftwaffe was hammering them from above. There was nowhere to go but the sea. What happened next stunned the world. Civilian boats, fishing vessels, pleasure crafts, small yachts, anything that could float crossed the English Channel. Retired sailors, fishermen, teenage boys who had never been in open water piloted their boats toward the burning horizon. They didn't do it because they were ordered to. They did it because British soldiers were dying on that beach. Over 9 days, 338,226 Allied soldiers were rescued. Eyewitness accounts from the beach describe something that military historians still cite today. Amid the bombing, the strafing, the chaos, the British soldiers formed organized queues on the beach. They stood in the water, sometimes shoulder-deep, waiting their turn. They were described by one rescue sailor as dead beat, having had a terrible time fighting their way to the beaches, and yet they waited in disciplined rows. One observer wrote that it was the most magnificent display of British discipline he had ever seen. Winston Churchill called the rescue a miracle of deliverance, but he also warned the nation, with brutal honesty, we must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. And the British didn't stop at Dunkirk. Thousands of men didn't make it to the coast. They kept fighting. The 51st Highland Division, a force so fierce the Germans had nicknamed their ancestors in World War I, the Ladies from Hell, for their kilted ferocity, held the line in France while their comrades escaped. They bought time with their lives. Their contribution was so impressive that even French General Charles de Gaulle, a man not easily impressed by anyone, was convinced that if other British troops fought with the same aggression as the Highlanders, the war could still be won. Back to that morning, June 6, 1944. The British and Canadian forces tasked with taking gold, Juno, and sword beaches faced something the history books often understate. German resistance was fierce, organized, and murderous. But the British forces moved with a kind of methodical, grinding determination that their American counterparts noticed. American military historians have written that while U.S. forces were brilliant in open warfare, fluid, aggressive, willing to take risks, the British brought something different to the table. They had been at war since 1939. 5 years of bloodshed had created soldiers who approached combat with a cold, experienced patience. They had already buried a generation of fathers in the trenches of World War I. They knew what war cost, and they paid the bill anyway. By the end of the Normandy campaign, over 83,000 British and Canadian soldiers had been killed or wounded. The British Second Army and its Canadian counterparts absorbed enormous German pressure around the city of Caen, battles so brutal and so costly that they drew the bulk of German panzer divisions away from the American breakout to the west. In other words, British soldiers bled so American soldiers could move. That is a fact, not sentiment, fact. Now let's talk about what U.S. Marines specifically began to notice about the British when they trained and fought alongside them in the modern era. It starts with a piece of headgear. The British Royal Marines Commando course is not just a training program. It is, by official record, the longest basic infantry training of any NATO or Commonwealth nation on Earth. While U.S. Marine Corps boot camp runs for 13 weeks, already the longest of any American military branch, the Royal Marines Commando training runs for 32 weeks. That's nearly 8 months of continuous testing, breaking, and rebuilding a human being. And those 32 weeks end not with a graduation ceremony. They end with 4 commando tests that are unlike anything most soldiers in the world will ever face. The first is the endurance course. Recruits must navigate 2 miles of tunnels, water pools, streams, bogs, and dense woodland, and then run 4 more miles back to camp. When they arrive, exhausted and soaked, they must score at least 6 out of 10 in a marksmanship test. Shaking hands, burning lungs, they still have to shoot straight. The second is the 9-mile speed march. Recruits have 90 minutes to complete 9 miles as a unified squad, carrying 30 pounds of equipment and a rifle, not individually. As a squad, every man must finish. The team either passes together or fails together. The third is the Tarzan Assault Course, an aerial obstacle course to be completed in 13 minutes while carrying 30 pounds of equipment. Ropes, walls, heights, speed. The fourth, and the one that ends careers, is the 30-mile march. Across Dartmoor, one of the harshest moorland environments in Britain, through mixed terrain, through whatever the British weather decides to throw at you, to be completed in under 8 hours, carrying 40 pounds of equipment and a rifle. Any man who passes all 4 earns the right to wear the green beret. U.S. Marines who have gone through an exchange program and attempted the British Commando course have come back changed. Several have described the experience as the hardest thing they have ever done, and these are men who completed the U.S. Marine Corps Crucible, a 54-hour continuous endurance event designed to push recruits to their physical and mental limits. There is a story, documented in British military forums and confirmed by veterans, of a joint mountaineering exercise between the United States Marine Corps and the Royal Marines. The American Marines wore T-shirts that said USMC, second to none. The Royal Marines wore T-shirts that said one word, none. No argument was made, none was needed. April 2, 1982, Stanley, Falkland Islands. Argentina invaded. A British overseas territory 8,000 miles from London, suddenly occupied by Argentine forces. The British military response was immediate. Within days, a naval task force was assembled and dispatched across the South Atlantic, into winter conditions, into hostile waters, toward an enemy that had every geographical advantage. On paper, the British had no right to win this war. The Argentine military had more men on the ground. They had the home advantage on the islands. They had dug-in defensive positions. The British had an impossibly long supply line, deteriorating weather, and a ticking clock before the South Atlantic winter made naval operations impossible. What happened over the next 74 days is studied in military academies around the world, including the United States Naval War College and the Marine Corps University. The Special Air Service and the Special Boat Service deployed alongside the Royal Marines Commandos. Together, they conducted reconnaissance operations, direct action raids, and deception campaigns against Argentine positions. At Pebble Island, SAS troops raided an Argentine airfield under cover of darkness and destroyed 11 enemy aircraft. The entire operation lasted 30 minutes. Not one SAS soldier was killed. On South Georgia, Royal Marines fought off the initial Argentine invasion with such ferocity that Argentine forces, who should have been overwhelmed within hours, took far longer than expected to subdue a tiny garrison. That fight, against impossible odds, became a symbol of what British soldiers do when their backs are against the wall. Then the march south began. British parachute regiment soldiers, the Paras, yomped across the islands carrying full combat loads, in freezing rain, through peat bogs, over hillsides, in terrain that would defeat most armies before a single shot was fired. They walked, they fought, they walked again. At Goose Green, 600 soldiers of the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment attacked a force of over 1,500 Argentine troops defending a prepared position. The odds were nearly 3-1 against them. They attacked anyway. They won. The American military community watched the Falklands War closely. U.S. Marine officers who later wrote about the campaign described the British performance as a masterclass in light infantry warfare, aggressive, adaptive, relentless, and conducted with a level of physical endurance that was, in their words, extraordinary. What the Americans noticed most was not the tactics, it was the attitude. British soldiers in the Falklands were not loudly confident, they were quietly certain. There is a difference. Loudness fades under fire, quiet certainty does not. 2001 to 2014, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The British Army deployed to Helmand, considered the most dangerous province in Afghanistan, and stayed there for 13 years. What they experienced in those years, and how they handled it, is what finally made many senior U.S. Marines say what they had been thinking for a long time. Helmand was not a conventional war. It was a grinding, relentless, close-quarters fight against an enemy that knew the terrain, the people, and the culture far better than any foreign soldier could. British forces, primarily the Royal Marines of 3 Commando Brigade, the Parachute Regiment, and various infantry regiments, operated in conditions that U.S. commanders described as among the most demanding of any conflict since World War II. The British soldier in Helmand did something that struck American observers repeatedly. He carried less technology and more grit. American forces were correctly resourced with enormous logistical and technological support. Air power, surveillance drones, rapid casualty evacuation, armored vehicles. The British, operating on a tighter budget, often had fewer of these tools available. And yet they fought. Veterans who served alongside British forces in Helmand, both U.S. Marines and U.S. Army soldiers, have spoken publicly about the experience. Their accounts carry a common thread. The British soldier, they said, operated in a way that felt timeless. He patrolled on foot. He engaged the community. He absorbed punishment without flinching. He adapted at a speed that surprised even experienced American commanders. One element that came up repeatedly was the British attitude toward hardship. There is a phrase in the British military, so old it has no traceable origin, that captures it perfectly: crack on. It means stop complaining, assess the situation, and continue. It is not callousness, it is clarity. When everything around you is falling apart, the British soldier cracks on. U.S. Marine officers who embedded with British units in Helmand have written in after-action reports and memoirs that the experience was professionally humbling. They came in as the representatives of the most powerful military in the world. They left with a different kind of respect for an ally who had been doing this, in various forms, in various corners of the earth, for over 300 years. Let's put the facts side by side, because the numbers matter. United States Marine Corps Boot Camp, 13 weeks. It is the longest basic training of any branch of the American military. It includes the Crucible, a 54-hour final test involving continuous physical challenges, day and night assault courses, land navigation, and over 40 miles of marching. Recruits are sleep-deprived and food-restricted throughout. Only those who survive it earn the title United States Marine. Royal Marines Commando Training, 32 weeks. It is the longest basic infantry training of any NATO nation. It includes the 4 commando tests described earlier. The 30-mile march across Dartmoor alone is a test that many professional soldiers from other nations have attempted and failed. Royal Marines Officer Training, 60 weeks, 15 months. Officers complete everything the enlisted recruits complete, and then far more. The reasoning is simple and uncompromising. The men under an officer's command need to know that their leader will never ask them to do something he cannot do himself, so the officer must be able to do everything, and then some. Failure rates for Royal Marines training regularly run at 30 to 40%, sometimes higher. That means that nearly half of the men who attempt it do not finish it. They are not told they are weak. They are told the standard exists, and if they cannot meet it, the Green Beret is not for them. When US Marines have gone through exchange programs and attempted the British Commando tests, they have universally reported that the experience recalibrated their understanding of human endurance. These are not ordinary men saying this. These are United States Marines, men who have already proven they belong to one of the toughest organizations on Earth. And they came back saying, "We've never seen anything like this." It would be easy and wrong to reduce this to a competition about who has the harder training. That misses the point entirely. What US Marines genuinely respect about British soldiers goes beyond physical endurance. It lives in a set of qualities that are cultural, institutional, and deeply historical. The first is stoicism, not the performative toughness of someone who wants you to know they are tough. Real stoicism, the kind that comes from hundreds of years of military tradition built on the understanding that war is terrible, that good men die, that the mission continues regardless. The British soldier has a reputation for understatement that is famous across the world. A soldier loses a hand. He describes it as a bit of a setback. A unit comes under heavy fire. They note that it was rather lively. This is not denial. It is a deeply ingrained refusal to let pain become larger than the task at hand. The second is adaptability. The British military has historically operated on a smaller scale than American forces, which means British soldiers have had to be more creative with fewer resources. The Falklands campaign is the ultimate example. A task force assembled in days, dispatched across the South Atlantic, fighting in conditions no British military unit had trained specifically for, and winning. The SAS was founded on exactly this principle: small numbers of highly skilled, adaptable men accomplishing what large conventional forces cannot. The third is regimental identity. The British Army's regimental system, where soldiers belong to a regiment with centuries of history, its own battle honors, its own traditions, its own sense of family, creates a form of unit cohesion that American commanders have openly admired. A British soldier doesn't just fight for his country, he fights for his regiment, for the names carved on the memorial in the barracks square, for the men buried in the churchyard in Hereford. That weight is not a burden, it is armor. The fourth is experience. Britain has been continuously at war somewhere in the world for the better part of 4 centuries. There is almost no terrain, no climate, no type of conflict that some part of the British military has not faced. Jungle warfare in Malaya, Arctic warfare in Norway, desert warfare in North Africa, the Gulf, and Afghanistan, urban warfare in Northern Ireland, a 30-year low-level conflict that produced some of the most tactically sophisticated soldiers in the world. That experience doesn't disappear between wars. It becomes doctrine, it becomes culture. Respect in the military world is a two-way road. British soldiers, particularly Royal Marines and paratroopers who have trained and fought alongside their American counterparts, speak about US Marines with the same kind of careful, measured admiration that the Americans have for them. They point to the sheer scale of American military power, the logistical capability, the air support, the firepower available to a U.S. Marine unit in the field is, in British terms, almost unimaginable. British soldiers who have operated under American air cover describe the experience as professionally reassuring in a way that is difficult to overstate. They also point to the American Marines' aggression, the USMC's doctrine of every Marine a rifleman, the idea that every single person in the Corps, regardless of their specialist role, is first and foremost a combat soldier, is something that British military professionals admire deeply. A U.S. Marine logistics officer can fight. A U.S. Marine band member can fight. The combat readiness of the entire organization, from top to bottom, is something the British respect without reservation. They note the American willingness to take casualties and continue the attack. The U.S. Marine Corps has a battle history: Belleau Wood, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Chosin Reservoir, Hugh City, Fallujah, that represents some of the most ferocious and costly fighting in the history of modern warfare. In every one of those engagements, Marines attacked when any rational assessment of the situation said they should not, and they won. That is not something the British overlook. That is something they understand in the marrow of their bones, because they have done the same thing at Rorke's Drift, at Arnhem, at Goose Green. Two militaries, different cultures, different methods, different traditions, but underneath it all, the same understanding of what it means to be a soldier when the world falls apart around you. Politicians talk about the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. They mean trade deals, intelligence sharing, diplomatic alliances, all important, all real. But there is another special relationship that exists far below the level of politicians. It exists at the level of the man carrying a rifle, clearing a room, yomping across a hillside in the rain, taking fire in a foreign street, writing letters home that he hopes he won't be too embarrassed by if he survives. That relationship was forged at Normandy. It was tested in Korea, where British and American forces fought under the same United Nations flag in sub-zero temperatures against a Chinese army that had them massively outnumbered. It was reaffirmed in the Gulf War, in Bosnia, in Sierra Leone, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan. In every one of those places, American Marines and British soldiers have looked across at each other through smoke and chaos and recognized something, not just an ally, something deeper. The recognition that they were built from similar material, shaped by similar values, that beneath the different accents, the different humor, the different uniforms, the same fire burned. U.S. Marine General James Mattis, a man whose tactical brilliance and personal courage are legendary in American military circles, famously said that he had never met a British soldier he didn't respect. Mattis is not a man who dispenses compliments casually. So what is it, precisely, that U.S. Marines say when they reflect on British soldiers? They say that the British soldier fights with an efficiency that borders on quiet ferocity. He doesn't need to announce it. He doesn't perform it. He simply does what needs to be done and then does the next thing. They say that British soldiers carry hardship differently from most militaries they have encountered. Not with bravado, not with complaints, with a kind of grim practicality that makes them exceptionally dangerous in prolonged, grinding conflicts where morale is the first casualty. They say the Royal Marines specifically, those men who have passed the 32-week gauntlet, who have marched 30 miles across Dartmoor carrying 40 pounds of kit in British weather, who have earned the right to wear the green beret, represent one of the highest standards of soldiering they have encountered anywhere in the world. They say the British Parachute Regiment is, man for man, one of the most aggressive light infantry forces on earth. They say the SAS is in a category of its own, not because of secrecy or mythology, but because of results. In the Falklands, in the Gulf, in Bosnia, in Afghanistan, the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment delivered outcomes in conditions that defied conventional military logic. An SAS four-man patrol does what other militaries need a company for. And they say this is the part that means the most, that they trust them. In the military world, trust is the ultimate currency. It cannot be bought or manufactured or awarded. It is earned in mud and blood and shared fear. American Marines trust British soldiers with their lives. That trust is not given to many. June 6, 1944. On that beach, in that cold grey morning, two nations wrote something in the sand that the tide has never washed away. They wrote it again in the mountains of Korea, in the deserts of Helmand, in the freezing waters south of the Falkland Islands, in every place where men who wore the same Allied patch turned to each other and said, without words, "I've got you." The US Marines who said, "We've never seen anything like this," about British soldiers were not surrendering their pride. They were expressing the deepest form of professional admiration that exists in the military world. They were saying, "You are what we want to be at our best." And the British soldiers, who said the same things about American Marines, were saying the same thing back. Two of the greatest military traditions in the history of the modern world, born from the same roots, sharpened by different fires, brought together again and again whenever the world needs men who will not stop. The green beret and the eagle globe and anchor. Per mer per terram. By sea, by land. Always.